The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The place was buzzing with activity: families dragging suitcases, business people talking on phones, and airport staff zooming around on small carts. Among the crowd stood Sergeant James Wilson, his military uniform crisp despite his long journey. He had just returned from his third tour in Afghanistan, 15 months away from home, 15 months of sand, danger, and missing his family. The weight of his experiences showed in the tiny lines around his eyes, though he stood tall with the disciplined posture that had become second nature after years of service. James checked his boarding pass again and smiled to himself. First class. It had been a last-minute decision, a rare treat he felt he deserved after everything he'd been through. The extra money would put a small dent in his savings, but today was special. Today he was finally going home. Zone 1 and first-class passengers may now begin boarding, announced a voice over the speaker system. James took his place in line, his single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't one for excess luggage. Life in the military had taught him to pack light and efficiently. A few people ahead of him in the first-class line stood a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled gray-blonde hair. She wore an expensive-looking cream blazer, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and jewelry that caught the light with every movement. Her name was Diane Mercer, though James didn't know that yet. She tapped her manicured nails impatiently against her leather handbag as the line inched forward. When Diane noticed James standing behind her, her eyes flicked over his uniform, then to his boarding pass, then back to his face. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening around the mouth. She turned away quickly and muttered something under her breath that sounded like, "They let anyone up front these days." James pretended not to hear. He'd faced worse, much worse, and had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. He focused instead on thoughts of home, his mother's cooking waiting for him, his younger brother's college graduation ceremony tomorrow that he'd promised not to miss no matter what. What neither James nor Diane noticed was the man standing just a few feet away, partially hidden behind a pillar. He was a bit shorter than average, with thoughtful eyes and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a small ponytail. His casual clothes, jeans, and a simple black t-shirt made him blend into the crowd, but anyone in the film industry would have immediately recognized Martin Reynolds, the award-winning director whose films had grossed billions worldwide. Martin had been people watching while waiting for his flight, an old habit that had helped him create some of his most memorable characters. His interest had been caught by the soldier's quiet dignity and then by the wealthy woman's barely disguised contempt. The contrast between them was striking, almost like a scene from one of his movies. As the line moved forward, Diane handed her boarding pass to the gate agent with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lovely day for flying, isn't it?" she said cheerfully, all traces of her earlier annoyance gone. The gate agent nodded politely and wished her a pleasant flight. When it was James's turn, the young gate agent's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she said, her voice filled with respect as she checked his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard." James thanked her with a nod and headed down the jetway. The cool air of the bridge was a welcome relief from the stuffy terminal. He felt a flicker of excitement. First class would be a new experience. He pictured the wider seats, the extra legroom, maybe even a decent meal. Small luxuries, but ones he had been dreaming about during those long hot days in the desert. Behind him, Martin Reynolds discreetly followed, his curiosity piqued. Something told him this story wasn't over yet. As a storyteller, he had developed an instinct for human drama, and right now, that instinct was telling him to pay attention. None of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to intersect in ways they couldn't imagine. And it would all unfold at 30,000 feet in the air, where there would be nowhere to escape the consequences of what was about to happen. The narrow aisle of the airplane felt even smaller as James made his way through the first-class cabin. He checked his boarding pass again, seat 3A, a window seat on the left side. He'd specifically chosen it when booking, wanting to watch the landscape change beneath him on his journey home. When he reached row 3, James stored his duffel bag in the overhead bin and slid into his seat. The leather was soft and cool against his back, and he couldn't help but smile at the generous legroom before him. For someone who stood over 6 feet tall, This was a luxury he rarely experienced on flights. "Would you like something to drink before takeoff, sir?" asked a flight attendant with a kind smile. Her name tag read Sophie Chen. "Just water, please," James replied. As Sophie walked away, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the first real moment of peace he'd had in months. That peace was short-lived. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. James opened his eyes to see Diane standing in the aisle, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. "I believe you're in my seat." James double-checked his boarding pass. 3A, he said, showing her the ticket. "This is 3A. Diane's lips pressed into a thin line as she pulled her own boarding pass from her purse. She glanced at it quickly, then back at James with an expression that suggested she wasn't used to being questioned. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. "I always book a window seat." By now, Sophie had returned with James's water. Noticing the tension, she approached with professional calm. "Is there a problem here?" "This gentleman is sitting in my seat," Diane stated, gesturing toward James as if he were an unwelcome piece of furniture. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Sophie asked. James handed his over without hesitation. Diane did the same, though with a slight huff of impatience. Sophie checked both tickets carefully. "Sir, you're in the correct seat, 3A, she confirmed, handing James back his boarding pass. Then, turning to Diane, she added, "Ma'am, you're assigned to seat 3B, the aisle seat right here." A flush crept up Diane's neck and into her cheeks. "That can't be right," she insisted. "I specifically requested a window seat when I booked." "I understand your preference," Sophie replied gently, "but according to our system, this is the seat assigned to you for this flight." The passengers around them were trying to pretend they weren't listening, but their sideways glances told a different story. 3 rows back, Martin Reynolds observed the unfolding drama with keen interest, his filmmaker's mind already framing the scene. Diane lowered her voice, though not enough. "Look," she said to Sophie, leaning in, "I don't think you understand. These seats are very expensive." Perhaps he misread his ticket. Or maybe the system made an error in upgrading certain people. The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. An uncomfortable silence fell over the first-class cabin. James stared straight ahead, his face a careful mask that revealed nothing of what he must be feeling. He'd faced enemy fire with less tension in his shoulders than he showed now. "Ma'am," Sophie began, her professional tone taking on a slight edge, "Sergeant Wilson is in his correct assigned seat. Your seat is 3B. If you'd prefer a window seat, I can check if there are any other window seats available in first class, but I can't ask him to move from a seat he's properly booked and paid for." Diane's eyes widened slightly at Sophie's use of James's rank. She looked at him again, this time taking in the service ribbons on his uniform, the combat patches that told stories she couldn't begin to understand. "I can't sit here," Diane declared loudly, ignoring Sophie's offer to check for other seats. "Can't you move him to coach where he belongs?" The cabin went dead silent. A woman across the aisle gasped audibly. An older gentleman 2 rows up shook his head in disgust. James remained perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his armrests, his eyes focused on some distant point outside the window. His face betrayed nothing, but the slight tightening of his jaw spoke volumes about the effort it took to maintain that composure. No one noticed that Martin had shifted slightly in his seat, angling his phone to capture what was happening. No one except Sophie, whose eyes briefly met his before returning to the situation at hand. The confrontation had reached a tipping point, and everyone on board knew it. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Diane's words, "Can't you move him to coach where he belongs?" seemed to hang in the air, bouncing off the walls of the plane and into the ears of every passenger within hearing distance. James took a slow, deep breath. His fingers curled slightly against the armrests, the only visible sign of his discomfort. He'd faced discrimination before, the subtle kind with sideways glances and whispered comments, and the not-so-subtle kind that came with direct words and closed doors. But something about being cornered on this plane in his uniform after 15 months of serving his country made this moment particularly bitter. An older man sitting across the aisle cleared his throat loudly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of the Deep South, "I believe you're holding up the boarding process." His eyes, kind but firm beneath bushy white eyebrows, met Diane's with unmistakable disapproval. Sophie, the flight attendant, placed herself slightly between Diane and James, a supple but clear gesture of protection. "Mrs. Mercer," she said quietly, using the name she'd seen on the boarding pass, "I need to ask you to take your assigned seat now. We're scheduled for an on-time departure." Diane's face flushed deeper, a mix of anger and embarrassment coloring her cheeks. She glanced around at the other passengers, perhaps expecting to find allies, but found only averted eyes or outright disapproval. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I paid $4,000 for this ticket." "So did I," James said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice was calm, measured, with a quiet dignity that made several passengers look up. "Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable. If it helps, I'd be happy to switch to the aisle seat." The offer, so reasonable and kind after Diane's behavior, seemed to throw her off balance. For a moment, she appeared genuinely confused, as if kindness was the last response she'd expected. "That's not," she began, then stopped herself. Perhaps even she realized how it would sound to refuse such a simple solution. "Fine," she finally said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. As James stood to let her in, another passenger, a young woman with a small child, shook her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," she whispered to her husband, not quite quietly enough. Diane settled into her seat with the stiff movements of someone trying to maintain their dignity while knowing they've lost the moral high ground. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at James as he sat back down beside her. A painful silence stretched between them as the rest of the passengers boarded. James pulled a worn paperback from his pocket, a dog-eared copy of a historical novel his brother had sent him months ago. He'd saved it for the journey home, a small pleasure to pass the time. Sophie returned, leaning down to speak quietly to James. "I'm so sorry about that, Sergeant Wilson," she said, her voice pitched just low enough that only he could hear. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff?" "I'm fine, thank you," he replied with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. 3 rows back, Martin Reynolds watched the scene with growing interest. As a filmmaker, he'd always been fascinated by human behavior, the small dramas that played out every day in ordinary places. This, however, was extraordinary. The soldier's dignity in the face of such blatant prejudice, the flight attendant's subtle alliance, the silent judgment of the other passengers, it was like watching a perfectly scripted scene unfold in real time. He had captured most of the interaction on his phone, though he wasn't yet sure why. Something told him it mattered, that this moment, this collision of privilege and prejudice, of service and entitlement, deserved to be witnessed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure and asking the flight attendants to prepare for takeoff. Sophie moved away to her position, though not before giving James a sympathetic glance. As the plane began to taxi, Diane pulled out a fashion magazine and began flipping through it with deliberate attention, creating a paper barrier between herself and James. He continued reading his novel, seemingly absorbed in the story, though anyone watching closely might have noticed he hadn't turned a page in several minutes. The engines roared louder as the plane gathered speed. In moments they would be airborne, leaving the ground behind, but carrying this uncomfortable tension with them into the sky. And no one on board, not James, not Diane, and not even Martin with his filmmaker's intuition, could have predicted what would happen next. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign pinged off. The first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the engines and occasional clank of ice in drinks. James had finally managed to focus on his book, while Diane continued flipping through her magazine with more force than necessary. Sophie moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, taking drink orders and offering warm towels. When she reached row 3, her smile for James was genuine. For Diane, it was polite but noticeably cooler. "Charbonnet," Diane said without looking up. "And for you, Sergeant?" Sophie asked. "Just water is fine, thank you." As Sophie turned to get their drinks, a man stood up 3 rows back. At first, no one paid much attention, just another passenger heading to the restroom, perhaps. But instead of walking toward the lavatory, he approached row 3. "Excuse me," he said, his voice pleasant but carrying enough authority that both James and Diane looked up. Standing in the aisle was Martin Reynolds. In his simple black t-shirt and jeans, he might not have looked important to those who didn't recognize him. But from the way several passengers' eyes widened, it was clear that many knew exactly who he was. "I couldn't help overhearing the situation earlier," Martin said. His voice was calm, the kind that commanded attention without raising its volume. "And I wanted to offer a solution." Diane straightened, suddenly very aware of who she was speaking to. The director of 4 Academy Award-winning films was looking directly at her, and not with admiration. "I'd be happy to trade my seat with the lady if she's uncomfortable," Martin continued. "I'm in 6C, it's an aisle seat as well, but perhaps the company might be more to your liking." The slight emphasis on the word company was subtle but unmistakable. A flush crawled up Diane's neck. "That's very kind, but I'm settled now," she said, attempting a casual smile that came across more like a grimace. "Are you sure?" Martin persisted. "Because from what I observed, you seemed quite distressed about your seating arrangement." Several passengers were now watching openly, some even turning in their seats for a better view. The young mother from earlier was whispering to her husband, her eyes bright with the excitement of witnessing justice in real time. Diane began, then faltered. She was trapped in a situation entirely of her own making. Martin turned to James. "Sergeant, I'd consider it an honor to trade places with this lady so I could sit next to you. I've always had tremendous respect for our service members." James looked surprised, but nodded. "That's very kind of you, sir." "It's Martin, please," he said, extending his hand. James shook it firmly. Sophie appeared at Martin's side, having observed the interaction. "I'd be happy to help with the seat change, if that works for everyone," she offered, looking pointedly at Diane. Put on the spot with all eyes on her, Diane had little choice. "Fine," she said, gathering her things with jerky movements. "If everyone insists on making such a fuss about it." As Diane collected her belongings, an older woman across the aisle caught her eye and shook her head slightly. The gesture wasn't aggressive, just disappointed, which somehow made it worse. Once the switch was complete, Martin settled into the seat beside James. "I hope you don't mind the company," he said. "I've been working on a film about military families, and I'd value hearing about your experiences." "Only if you're comfortable sharing, of course." James seemed to relax for the first time since boarding. "I don't mind at all." From her new seat in 6C, Diane could see them beginning to talk, Martin leaning in with genuine interest as James spoke. She opened her magazine again, trying to appear absorbed, but her eyes kept drifting back to them. Sophie passed by with a knowing smile. "Can I get you anything in your new seat, Mrs. Mercer?" "No," Diane replied shortly, then catching herself added, "Thank you." As the flight continued, the buzz of conversation spread through the cabin. Passengers whispered to each other, some casting glances at Diane, others at Martin and James. Someone a few rows back was typing furiously on their phone. What none of them realized, least of all Diane, was that this incident was about to travel much farther than their flight from Atlanta. In the age of social media, a moment of prejudice witnessed by the right person could become a story seen by millions. And Martin Reynolds had millions of followers. As the flight progressed, the unlikely pair in row 3 continued their conversation. James spoke about his time in Afghanistan, not the combat or the danger, but the small human moments that had stayed with him. The children who would follow the soldiers around their village. The elderly man who invited him for tea every Tuesday. The stray dog his unit had adopted and named Lucky. Martin listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly engaged. "That's exactly the kind of story people need to hear," he said at one point. "Not just the headlines about war, but the everyday connections that happen in the middle of it all." James nodded, surprised by how easy it was to talk to someone so famous. "Most people just ask if I've killed anyone," he admitted. "They don't want to hear about the schools we helped rebuild or the medical clinics we set up." "Well, I want to hear all of it," Martin said. "I'm working on a new project, a film about military families and the challenges they face when soldiers return home. The disconnect between their experiences and civilian life." A flight attendant, not Sophie, but an older man with a kind face, stopped by with fresh drinks. Anything else I can get for you, gentlemen? After he left, Martin lowered his voice slightly. I've been looking for consultants with real experience. People who can make sure we get the details right, the emotions authentic. He paused, watching James's face. I don't suppose you'd be interested in sharing your perspective. James blinked in surprise. Me? I'm not in the film industry. That's exactly why I want your input. You have something no actor or writer can fake: lived experience. 6 rows back, Diane shifted uncomfortably in her seat. From her new vantage point, she could only see the backs of their heads, but it was clear they were deep in conversation. She tried to focus on her magazine, but the words blurred together. Her mind kept replaying the humiliating scene, the way Martin had called her out, the disapproving looks from the other passengers, the whispers that she could still hear floating around the cabin. The passenger next to her, a businessman in his 60s, hadn't spoken a word to her since she'd taken the seat. Now he was typing something on his phone, angling the screen away from her. Diane caught a glimpse of a social media app open before he turned it completely. "Excuse me," she said to the flight attendant passing by. "Could I get another glass of wine, please?" Of course, he replied professionally, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Back in row 3, Martin was telling James about his upcoming film. "We're starting production in 3 months. The script is almost there, but it needs something more authentic." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through some photos. "Here's some concept art for the main set, a family home where most of the story takes place." James leaned over to look, impressed by the detailed images. "That looks just like my cousin's place in Virginia." "The casting director is still looking for our lead," Martin continued, showing him a document with character descriptions. "A returning Army sergeant, 30 to 35, who's struggling to reconnect with his family after his 3rd tour. Sound familiar?" He smiled. James laughed softly. "A little too familiar." As they continued talking, James didn't notice the occasional passenger snapping a photo of them, nor did he see the growing activity on social media. One passenger, a college student with a large following, had tweeted, "Witnessing something amazing on my flight today. Woman tried to deny a black soldier his first-class seat. Then Martin Reynolds stepped in." The tweet was already gathering hundreds of retweets. Halfway through the flight, the conversation shifted to James's family. "My brother graduates college tomorrow," he said proudly. "First one in our family to get a degree. That's why I splurged on the first-class ticket. Wanted to make sure nothing would delay me getting home for his ceremony." Martin nodded thoughtfully. "Family's what matters most in the end. That's what all my films really come down to, the connections that hold us together through the hardest times." From her seat, Diane could hear fragments of their conversation whenever the cabin noise dipped. She caught mentions of film budgets, shooting schedules, and what sounded like job offers. With growing horror, she realized that the soldier she had tried to humiliate was now potentially being offered a position on what would undoubtedly be a high-profile film project. Her phone vibrated with an email notification. Her boss. The subject line read simply, "Call me ASAP when you land." A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Something was happening, something beyond this flight, and somehow she knew it wasn't going to be good for her. As the plane began its initial descent, Diane Mercer had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her actions would be. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, tires squealing against the runway. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers began the familiar routine of gathering belongings and checking phones that had been in airplane mode. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Nashville International Airport," the captain announced. "Local time is 5:42 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 76 degrees. In row 3, James and Martin exchanged contact information. Martin handed James a business card with his personal number scribbled on the back. "Call me next week," he said. "My production office will set up a proper meeting. I'm serious about having you consult on this project." James tucked the card carefully into his wallet. "Thank you, sir. I will." "Martin," the director corrected him with a smile. "And thank you for your service, not just the words people say, but genuinely. What you do matters." 6 rows back, Diane's face paled as she scrolled through her phone. Notifications flooded her screen. Text messages from friends, emails from coworkers, and worst of all, dozens of social media alerts. With trembling fingers, she tapped on one that read, Is this you on Flight 1457? The link opened to a Twitter post that already had thousands of retweets. Someone had filmed the entire confrontation and Martin's intervention, capturing her words clearly, "Can't you move him to coach where he belongs?" The caption read, "Watch entitled woman try to kick black soldier out of his first-class seat, then get schooled by famous director Martin Reynolds." Comments flooded the post, each one more damning than the last. "This is disgusting. He serves our country and she treats him like that. Her company needs to see this. Anyone know where she works?" "I recognize her from the Thompson PR website. She's some big executive there." Diane's heart raced. Thompson PR was indeed her employer, a public relations firm that prided itself on inclusion and diversity. The irony might have been amusing if it wasn't so devastating to her career. The email from her boss suddenly made terrible sense. As passengers began to deplane, Diane stayed frozen in her seat, phone clutched in her hand. The businessman next to her stood to retrieve his bag, giving her a cold glance before moving into the aisle. Near the front of the plane, Sophie helped James get his duffel bag from the overhead compartment. "It was a pleasure having you on our flight, Sergeant Wilson," she said warmly. "And I'm sorry about earlier." "Nothing to apologize for," James replied. "You were very professional." Martin stood in the aisle, waiting for James. "My driver's meeting me outside. Can I offer you a ride somewhere?" "That's generous, but my mom's picking me up," James said. "Been waiting 15 months to see her." Martin nodded in understanding. Family first always. As they moved toward the exit, passengers smiled at James, several thanking him for his service. A few asked Martin for autographs, which he politely declined, explaining he was in a hurry but posing quickly for one photo with a young aspiring filmmaker. Diane finally gathered the courage to stand, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. As she made her way up the aisle, she felt eyes following her. The young mother she'd noticed earlier pulled her child closer as Diane passed, as if protecting her from something toxic. In the terminal, James and Martin said their final goodbyes before heading in different directions. Neither noticed Diane emerging from the jetway behind them, her face a mask of barely controlled panic as she checked her phone again. Her Twitter mentions had doubled in the last 10 minutes. Someone had identified her company, and now people were tagging Thompson PR directly. The hashtag First Class Racist was trending in Nashville. Diane hurried toward the exit, sunglasses on despite being indoors, hoping to avoid being recognized. She'd been scheduled to give a presentation to the firm's biggest client tomorrow. Now she wondered if she'd even have a job by morning. Outside the airport, James spotted his mother waiting by her old blue sedan. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she ran forward, arms outstretched. As they embraced, tears streaming down both their faces, a Blacktown car pulled up nearby. Martin watched the reunion from his window, smiling softly before instructing his driver to pull away. And somewhere behind them all, Diane Mercer stepped into a taxi, her perfectly curated life beginning to unravel, all because of a first-class seat and the prejudice she couldn't hide. 2 weeks passed like a whirlwind. For James, they were filled with family celebrations, quiet moments of readjustment, and surprising new opportunities. For Diane, they brought a painful reckoning that forced her to confront truths she'd long ignored about herself. James sat in a small coffee shop near his mother's house, nervously straightening his tie. He traded his military uniform for a crisp white shirt and dark blue blazer. On the table before him sat a folder containing his discharge papers and resume, though Martin had assured him that the job was already his if he wanted it. The bell above the door jingled, and Martin walked in, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater. No entourage, no fanfare, just a man keeping a promise. He spotted James and smiled, waving away his attempt to stand. "Please, stay seated," Martin said, sliding into the chair across from him. "How's your brother doing? Enjoying life as a college graduate?" "He's great," James replied, his face lighting up. "Already got job offers from 3 different engineering firms." He paused, then added more quietly, "Thank you for the graduation gift you sent. It was incredibly generous." Martin waved it off. "The Scholarship Foundation is something my wife and I started years ago. Your brother earned it with his grades and community service." The waiter brought coffee, and they settled into conversation about the film project. Martin slid a thick folder across the table. The script, he explained, and a formal offer for you to join as a technical consultant and associate producer. The team loved your input on the early outlines. James's eyes widened as he flipped through the contract, stopping at the compensation page. The figure there was more than he'd earned in 2 years of military service. This is too much, he said, looking up. Martin shook his head. It's the standard rate, actually. Your perspective is valuable, James. You're not a charity case, you're an asset to this production. Across town, in a starkly different meeting, Diane sat across from her former boss, Thomas Rivera, in a small conference room. Her company badge, turned in last week, sat on the table between them. I appreciate you meeting with me, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. The perfectly styled hair and designer clothes couldn't hide the toll the past 2 weeks had taken. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she placed a folder on the table. To be honest, I was surprised you called, Thomas replied. The board was clear about their decision. The firing had been swift once the video went viral. Thompson PR, specializing in diversity and inclusion campaigns, couldn't afford to keep an executive who had been caught on camera making racist remarks. The client presentation Diane had been scheduled to give was reassigned. Her corner office was cleared out by the end of that first day. I'm not here to ask for my job back, Diane said, surprising Thomas. I'm here because I owe you and the company an apology. A real one, not the public statement my crisis manager put together. She opened the folder, revealing a handwritten letter. I've had a lot of time to think. What I did was inexcusable, not just because it was caught on camera, but because it revealed something ugly in me that I've been unwilling to face. Thomas remained silent, studying her. I also wanted you to know that I've enrolled in a diversity and bias awareness program, she continued, and I've been volunteering at the VA hospital downtown. She paused, her voice catching slightly. That was actually Sergeant Wilson's suggestion. Thomas raised his eyebrows. You contacted him? Diane nodded. Through Martin Reynolds' production company. I wanted to apologize directly. She smiled faintly. He was more gracious than I deserved. Back at the coffee shop, James and Martin were wrapping up their meeting when James's phone buzzed with a text message. Sorry, he said, checking it quickly. That's Mrs. Mercer. She's at the VA again today. How's that working out? Martin asked curiously. Better than I expected, James admitted. She started in the admin office, but now she's actually working with the veterans directly. Some of the guys say she's pretty good at helping them navigate the benefits system. Martin nodded thoughtfully. People can surprise you. Sometimes it takes a public fall to force a private reckoning. That's what my mom always says, James replied with a smile. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment. As they stood to leave, a young boy approached their table, wide-eyed and clutching a small notebook. Excuse me, he said shyly. Aren't you the soldier from the airplane video? My dad's in the army too. James knelt down to the child's level. I am. What's your name, buddy? As James signed the boy's notebook, Martin watched, already envisioning a new scene for the film, one about redemption, second chances, and the power of being seen for who you truly are, not just who you've been.